Redefine Our World. We welcome all of you both here in this space and those of you who are watching at home and online through live stream. I hope that you will find the interplay of ideas today thoughtful, encouraging, and challenging. This time I'd like to invite Dr. Charles Lanford to give us some details about today's protocols.
Thank you, Dan. The audience live is small. I'm told many people are expecting to watch it online, given COVID and the weather. But I want to welcome everyone, those of us here at Wesley's Sanctuary, those watching on YouTube Live, and those viewing a recorded version of today's events, which will be available on YouTube. We have an outstanding panel of speakers who have generously agreed to give us their time and thoughts on topics important to all of us today. This is the 18th year that Wesley United Methodist Church and Foundation, with the support this year from the League of Women Voters of Champaign County, who has provided a forum addressing various topics, but always with the same purpose: to have experts talk on how they interpret and understand important issues currently occurring in our world. Over the years, we've had the pleasure of hearing from many talented speakers who have had personal experience in and have deep understanding of their topics. These seminars have enabled us to better understand the many events and forces shaping the world around us. This year's panel holds promise of continuing that tradition. We live in interesting times with all the risks and opportunities such times hold. When you add a pandemic to the turmoil of wars, famine, political extremes, economic upheavals, mass migrations, gun violence, global warming with its resulting severe weather-related events, add in instantaneous bombardment of news from electronic media, and behold the promise of artificial intelligence, it is not surprising that anxiety is pervasive in our world today. Today's speakers will tell us what they see happening around them and what this portends for the world. Each speaker has been given 15 minutes, and after the first three speakers, we will have a brief stretch break when you may hand in your written questions to them in the center aisle, where we will collect them. After the next three speakers, we will collect questions in the same manner regarding their talks. In the interest of time, we will not take questions during or at the end of each talk, but when all of the talks have been completed, we will gather the speakers so they may answer as many questions as time allows. With your cooperation, we will try to move along efficiently and conclude on time. Please observe the public health guidelines of wearing a mask and maintaining distance between your family and social groups. I'll grab my program here. Our first speaker is Dr. James Leonard, whom many of you know. He will be speaking on changes in the provision of health care coming out of the pandemic experience. Dr. Leonard?
Thank you, Dr. Lansford. so I don't break your iPad.
Oh, thank you.
Put that right there. Thank you for this opportunity to lead things off today. I'm Dr. Jim Leonard. I'm the CEO and president of Carle Foundation, Carle Health, located here in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, but also spread throughout East Central and Central Illinois at this point in time. When given the opportunity to make this presentation, quite frankly, I'm sure like all of the speakers, it's like 15 minutes, really. This is more like a 15-session, 1 hour each potential presentation. Changes in the provision of healthcare post-pandemic. And so I really need to establish with you how I narrowed this down, which means I may not hit on a topic that you would like to ask a question about. And I have no problem with us expanding this going forward. It's again just in the interest of time and respect for the other presenters that I narrowed things a bit. And so my comments are really about what's going on in downstate Illinois. And we have connections both throughout the entire country and the world at this point, but chose to focus on really our geographic area because all of the areas have different pressures, different styles of delivery, and so I really needed to make this manageable. I have to start out by saying that I'm incredibly optimistic about healthcare, where it's been during the last 18 months, and where I believe that it's going during the coming decade and beyond. And a lot of that optimism is really a springboard from what's happened during the last 18 months of the pandemic. For decades, as we have looked at healthcare and the problems of healthcare, we have focused on really three things: access, affordability, and quality. And it's always been incredibly difficult to put all three together. Move two, and the third oftentimes falls out. And so I wanted to address things in that context of where we're at and how COVID has impacted access, affordability, and quality. The first thing that COVID has done is really accelerated the pace of many things that we were trying to do in the provision of care in downstate Illinois. Things where there was a great deal of reluctance from the providers, many times from patients or families or from the communities themselves. And quite frankly, when you strip away many things as COVID did, all of a sudden, many reluctances go away. So let's talk about quality. Much of our focus on quality has often been around the inpatient experience, mortality or death rates. And much of the provision of care has been around that subset of the population. Very important, acute care, whether it's neurosurgery, cardiovascular surgery, trauma, those sorts of areas. What we will see going forward, and we had been working on for 3 years, but the pace has significantly accelerated around quality, is now focused more on the community. What we began to call the social determinants, which we were working on. And what do we mean by social determinants? That's reaching into a community, the blocking and tackling of primary care, hypertension, diabetes, that access to care prenatally. All of those things were moving ahead, but moving at what I felt was too slow a pace. Lo and behold, with COVID, what have the vulnerable populations been? As you look across our community as well as across the entire country, that defined where a lot of the COVID morbidity and mortality has been, as well as in our nursing homes across the country. And so this acceleration of thought and delivery of care regarding diabetes, hypertension, working on obesity, which directly translates into food availability, recognizing housing and the importance of housing for a stable environment to even be able to take care of yourself, all of a sudden have become front and center because of what COVID pointed out. So even from a self-serving standpoint, There's something in it for everybody to make sure that we're dealing with the social determinants of healthcare, because the pandemic showed that when you have a pool of susceptible individuals at a higher risk for whatever reason, that all of us are impacted by that. And so that is one of the outcomes that you all will see going forward, I believe, and I know you will in our environment, is that pivot, if you will. One of the things that quickly comes into focus with that, though, is a discussion that we need to have. Maybe today, but for sure going forward, and I'll get to it around affordability, but I wanted to make sure right up front that I mentioned it. We've been very focused on the miracles of science that we've been able to do, and whether it's around genetics, the genomics, the medications that have been available. Messenger RNA served us very well in terms of a quick development of vaccines in a time frame that we never would have seen in previous times. That's all well and good, but a discussion around how we spend money on those miracle advances versus the dollars that are available as a society around that blocking and tackling. We should all have a voice in that going forward, and I really look forward to that discussion. Let's talk quickly around access, because that's something that is near and dear to almost everyone's heart, and I've heard about it on a daily basis. Access to primary care, right? Access to the emergency room. My physician, I tore a ligament in my knee and I can't get it fixed for 3 weeks. That's pretty inconvenient. Can't we do it quicker? How are we going to deal with access going forward? We had already begun to move ahead with e-visits prior to the appearance of the pandemic. And even with the size of our system, lo and behold, we had less than 100 visits, even though we had the capability available over almost a year. And that's 100 total visits. Within 2 weeks of the pandemic shutting everything down, we were doing 4,000 to 5,000 visits a week. That's not going to go away. Now, I know it will shift because it already has. What is the right percentage? What should be seen in an e-visit, and when do you need to be seen in person? And is there a certain ratio if you have hypertension that it's 3 visits electronically and 1 in person? All of that is being worked out as we go forward, but really striking a balance of how we use the technologies that are available. But it's different, and I know for some people it's uncomfortable to have an e-visit when you're always used to seeing your provider in person. Things are going to be different going forward, and we all have to adjust to that. I have to tell you that one of the things that this really puts at risk, and I've had this discussion within Carle Health, is primary care. Prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of patients being seen in convenient care. Millennials view access to care differently than maybe other generations and want to be seen at 7 o'clock on Saturday night when it's convenient. And if the primary care office isn't open, then we go to convenient care. If convenient care is not open, then we go to the emergency department. And oh, by the way, we won't spend several hours in the emergency room in the middle of the day and be away from our jobs. And so how primary care is delivered going forward, I will tell you, is going to feel different. And primary care will have to adjust to that 24/7 availability connected to the convenient care experience. And that's other names are used in other places around the country, but I hope and believe that most of you are familiar with what that means. And so how you are connected to a physician or a nurse practitioner will be different going forward, because the pressure is about being seen as much as it is about that connectivity. Now again, I'm speaking about primary care, not specialty care at this point. There hasn't been as much pressure to shift that availability and how that is done. Affordability. I already commented on the discussion that we need to have as a society regarding how our money will be used going forward. And again, it won't be just all in one bucket or another, but how do we want to deliver care? We've had some excellent examples from around the world of how different systems that we thought might be better than ours have also struggled in this pandemic, and moving forward, the adjustments that they will have to make to better serve their populations. And so I think we'll be in the same bucket with everyone else, if you will, about what that means and how we decide what our system looks like, all driven by the pandemic that we have experienced. Now, in wrapping things up, I have another couple of minutes, I believe. Pardon me?
You have 6 more minutes.
6 more minutes, okay. I spoke faster than I thought. I really wanted to address what we can look forward to, and again, this is my opinion, but I think is incredibly important that it be addressed. This pandemic, and when will we be in an endemic situation where the rules change a little bit? From our perspective, we believe that we're looking at least another year, if not more, of a pandemic situation, where the rules and regulations will continue to be very strict about how we interact, the social distancing, availability of visitors, if you will, in the hospital situation. And we think that that's just going to be a part of how we live our lives moving forward. I know that that may not be the news that everybody really wanted to hear, but when I think you look at the statistics about what's happening, and when you look at the numbers, not just in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, we really are quite some distance from being able to back things up, if you will, particularly around the infection rates that we're seeing. I also wanted to address something that's incredibly important going forward that will also impact all of you as you interact with the healthcare systems, but also the rest of the world, and it's been a discussion. Where did all the workers go? We have been impacted by that significantly as well. At this point, Carle Health has over 1,000 job openings that are available, and that is across the board. It is not just nurses, although we have a significant nursing shortage. It is also housekeeping. It is also food service. It is front desks where you interact, where the phones get answered. All of this has some type of assist moving into the future from a technological standpoint, but they aren't in place at this point. They haven't all been developed. We talk about artificial intelligence and the use of bots and different technologies to answer that, but there'll be some time before we bridge to those solutions. And so what we need is really from the community itself a recognition that there is a shortage of available labor. We can talk about why we think that that's so and how much better it'll get or won't get as we move forward, and how will we respond to that, and how can we work together to potentially create better educational opportunities, pools of individuals that have been excluded from employment that we can engage. This also gets to the workforce of people working from home as well as on site, and we've been significantly impacted by that already. We have people in over 26 states at this point working for Carle Health, and we're happy to have people in those other states that can connect electronically. But that creates a different type of communication and expectations as, again, we all move forward together. And you know many of the problems, but many of them will also show themselves, I believe, over the next 6 months as some people come back to work or back to the work site, and others continue to get further away and are connected electronically. Your experience will look and feel different. So the trust that we try and create is incredibly important, but the feedback that we need of how things are working and what isn't working versus what is an inconvenience is something we're all going to need to share with each other, not, in my opinion, just around healthcare, but in many aspects of our lives as we move forward. And so to not address the workforce issues and the opportunities around education and re-engaging people I think would be a huge error on our part and a real missed opportunity of what COVID has shown us. So with that, I wanted to wrap things up. Again, being respectful, I'm looking forward to the presentations from the other presenters here, and would be happy as we move ahead to field any questions, not just locally, but across from the nation or across international boundaries. So with that, Dr. Lansford.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leonard. That was, as usual in listening to you, I learned many things, so thank you. As Dr. Leonard stated, write your questions down if you have some. At the end of this session, we'll collect them and have a question and answer session at the end. Our next speaker is new in town. She comes from a little bit across to the west. But she's the new superintendent of the Unit 4 school district, Dr. Sheila Bruiser. Comes highly recommended. I sat in on the CU school breakfast earlier this year, and enjoyed her talk as well. So let's hear what she has to say about educational changes in this new era. Dr. Bruiser?
Good afternoon, and thank you.
Do you have slides?
Yeah, I do, but I also have them on my phone, so.
Oh, okay. Should we open this?
Okay.
Yeah. Great.
Let's get to the second slide. My apologies. There you go.
Thank you. All right. I don't know if it's going to show up here or not, but. Well, while he's coming, I'm thankful for this opportunity to speak. I'm just going to say that, but when I got the invite, I was like, wow, what a in-depth, difficult presentation to make on talking about the educational changes in this era during the pandemic, post-pandemic. I don't know where we are with the pandemic. I just know things are different in the education. So, and then I looked and I saw all the wonderful people who were on the program to speak, and I said, well, let me put my glasses on today so I can at least look like I know what I'm talking about. So, but here we go. Basically, as we talk about the educational changes in this new era, I'm going to speak basically coming from a perspective of it's a new day of learning. And that's what we talk about a lot in Unit 4, but this is not just Unit 4, this is across the country in the field of education. And I'm speaking from the aspect of our pre-K-12 educational system. So when I'm talking about this, I'm going to be looking at it from the perspective of three major areas, and I will not hit all the things that we can talk about education and the changes in the new era. There's just no way. There's not enough time in the day, in the year to hit all the things that are happening. But there are a lot of schools are becoming more and more of a political hotbed, so to speak. There's so many political issues that are coming into the school system. So I'll touch on some of those things that are happening due to the pandemic, and some of it was before the pandemic, but because of the pandemic, they are really at the forefront. So the socioeconomic and the digital divide, racism and social injustice, and the mental health issues that we're seeing in our schools across the country. So when the schools opened, and I'm putting a plug for Unit 4. We were excited about schools being open, kids coming back to school, teachers coming back, and we were all excited about our vision, about empowering each learner to thrive in a diverse and changing world. And when this was written, I don't think we realized that the world was really going to be changing the way it is, like we see today. And our mission is to positively transform learning and life outcomes for students through educational justice, equity, and excellence. Wow, we are here. So we have to really stop just speaking it, but now we actually have to walk this talk, this very thing that we have here, our vision and our mission for Unit 4, and actually it's across the country. It's here, and we really have to put forth the effort to make it come to fruition. So when school opened, We welcomed more than 10,000 students into our classrooms, and we were excited about it. And we see all the pictures here waving the students, and we're excited about everybody being there. And then all of a sudden, it hit us. We have some unfinished learning. Unfinished learning. A lot of times people speak to what happened over the past 18 months as learning loss, or there was no learning, but that is so inaccurate. There was a lot of learning happening, but it was unfinished learning. Learning transpired in different ways. It was learning, kids were at home and learning different things from at home within their communities. They were watching television, social media, and they were picking up different things. Our teachers were teaching. So when we say there was learning loss or there was no learning taking place, that is so inaccurate, because teachers were teaching. It just looked different. And sometimes we don't understand that. So when we talk about unfinished learning, we look at the Education Trust, and it uses the term unfinished learning as opposed to learning loss or learning gaps to describe the material that should have been presented to students but has not yet been mastered. And that's where we are. When the students came back to us into the classroom, we realized there was some unfinished learning, there were some gaps there. But it was like every single teacher was a first-year teacher again. Every administrator was a first-year administrator again. Students who had been in school before coming back after having not the same kind of structure that they're used to in the school setting, they were almost as if they were first-year students again. So that was difficult for us, and it still is. So the idea that learning is not complete better reflects the reality that all students can learn and gaps can be closed with equitable opportunities, materials, assessments, and high-quality instruction. And when we use this phrase, our goal is to redirect any focus on fixing students toward a focus on systemic changes to meet the needs of our students. And that's where we are. We have to get away from, we have to fix our kids, we have to fix our families, we have to fix, but how do we look toward a systemic change? And that is so difficult sometimes for educators. We want things the way they were. Newsflash, they're not going back the way they were. And in most instances, that's a good thing. So we're going to look at some systemic changes, and we have to get our community and our families ready for those changes across the system, because education will not be the way it was when my own kids were in school, and that's just a few years ago. I'm not quite as old as I look or feel some days, but my children went through as well. So one of the things we're looking at is the school wellness and social emotional learning. When students came back to us, they're traumatized. Trauma has hit every area of our nation, every zip code, every household, some type of trauma. Whether you experience a loss because of COVID, you lost family members, you may have lost that connection and needing to see and be and hug and talk to people on a daily basis, be in the classroom, teachers needed to be in front of their students, teaching, whatever it happens to be. But that social and emotional learning and that loss, that trauma that people are experiencing is real. So schools have to shift. We can't focus just on the reading and the writing and math and the social studies and things of that nature. We have to really look at the whole child. We've talked about that before, but it's really a reality for us now. Students are coming to us. Some of them are broken in so many different ways, and we have to be able to wrap our arms around them. And we talk about this a lot in education. We talk about Bloom's and the hierarchy of learning, but we also remember Maslow. So we're talking a lot about Maslow's before Bloom's. We really got to look at what is it that our students need? What are the social things that our kids need, their emotional aspects of their lives that we need to really wrap around and touch. So when we talk about these things, we talk about our social emotional learning, and it's a process which children and adults acquire knowledge and attitudes and skills that they need to recognize and manage their own emotions, demonstrate caring and concern for others. We're seeing a lot of people who are, it's like that care is not there anymore. They're cold in some aspects, but in some areas they do care for each other. But it's a mix of things. We have to help them establish positive relationships. Some of them have not been around other people for a long time, so needing to have those positive relationships is crucial. If we can't build relationships with our students, we can't reach them and we can't teach them. They have to know that we care. We have to help them make responsible decisions and to handle challenging situations constructively. So those are some of the issues that we're dealing with the school wellness. And it is true, it is prevalent, and we're seeing it every day with all the violence that we see in the community that is coming into the schools, in some of the homes. So we have to address this in a way that we all have to wrap around our schools, our students, our families. It has to be a community effort in order to make this happen. The digital instruction, teaching and learning, K-12 resources online, so you will see a lot more digital resources. We're shifting from the print to the digital piece. And during this time, like Unit 4 and most school districts are now one-to-one. So each student has their own device they can take home, bring back. We're also looking at the ways in which there's an increase in interest in online learning. So how do we find ways to reach students? Because during the pandemic, some students did better when they were home on the digital platform than they did when they were in the big school environment, and we forget about that. So how do we wrap our arms and our minds around how do we pull those pieces from students who did well with digital instruction, how do we bring that and bridge it into the systemic changes that we need to see happen in our school system? So we need to be more flexible with online learning. We need to shift from summative and high-stakes testing to more formative, competency-based assessment. What do I mean by that? We cannot do the one-size-fits-all anymore, where everyone learns the same material, then they get a test, they regurgitate it back, but we really don't know if they know what they're doing with it. Before the pandemic, there was a Post-Secondary Workforce Readiness Act that came out in 2016, where we're really looking at competency-based learning. How do we know our students really know the work that they're supposed to be doing? How do we know that they can take this work and apply it in a way that is going to be meaningful? We're talking about the workforce. Our school systems are looking for workers, not just teachers, every area. We are looking for people to help us. So we know that we have to grow our own. We know we have to get them ready for the workforce that in our community. So what does that look like? So when we talk about competency-based, doesn't mean everyone takes the same test. It means that I get to get an educational experience that fits my learning style. I can show you that if I'm going into the medical field, that I need to maybe perhaps do work in this way. I can do a project based upon what I'm interested in, and the way that I show you that I've mastered this material is not just a paper and pencil or an essay or true and false or multiple choice, but I can actually show you that I can do this work. We're also looking and thinking about how we can have more equitable access to internet connectivities and devices. One of those ways, how do we perhaps maybe put some hotspots and devices on our school buses so our kids can be learning while they're going to and from school so that the school day can continue on? And the reason is because there is still unfinished learning happening that needs to happen. So we need to make sure we're taking every opportunity to give every student an opportunity to learn. And we have students, unfortunately, right now, because of the lack of bus drivers, they're on buses for a long time. So how do we take that time on the buses and make it useful? Put some hotspots and devices on there and let them do some work while they're on the bus going home or when they're coming to school. How do we extend the learning throughout the day? What does it look like? And we're also looking at curriculum becoming more applicable in the global context, moving beyond local markets. So the things that our students saw across the country during the pandemic is no longer just what's happening right here in Champaign, but global. How do we bring the global context into the classroom and into the learning of our students to get them more understanding of what's happening in their community and what impact they have and what part and what role they play in making our society whole again? So I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to take a little time and be a little brazen here. I should, It's a call to action. Unit 4, we need you. We are looking for people to help us change the narrative. And during this pandemic, I did see a lot of people pouring into the community to help. But let's not stop. How do we continue this? We need volunteers for tutoring and mentoring and playground. We need our students to see that it takes a village, everyone to wrap around them to help them get to this next level in their learning. We have career opportunities, teachers, bus drivers, food service, nurses, teachers, teachers' aides. We need all of these to help us move forward in the work that we have going with our students. And when I talked a little bit earlier about the whole Social injustice. That is another area that we're looking at how we can help our students understand that if you see a need, and this goes right along with this call to action, you see a need, how can I be a part of that need? How can I be a part of what needs to transpire? Education is no more just, I got a book, let's read this book and let's regurgitate the information. But how do I take this and apply it to my situation? So we need to help our students see that they are global citizens. They're pouring into our community. They are our future. They are today. They are our right now. So how do we help them become a part of the change that's happening? How do we help them accept it? And when I also talked a little bit about the whole political piece, with the masks, we noticed students are okay. Most of our students are fine with wearing these in the classroom. I go visit classrooms, students have these on, teachers are teaching, kids are learning with the mask and they're okay with it. But then there's the other pieces. How long do we have to wear these? Is the question. How long? Well, our students really are to the point where they just want to be at school together to learn and to socialize and to help each other out. So what does that look like? So when we ask you to come and help us out, if you got to put the mask on, we just ask that you put the mask on and help us, because like I said before, a lot of things that are happening in our schools, especially during this time right now, is turning more toward a political issue than about teaching and learning, and we have to do a better job of making sure that we're not. So look at all these faces. Look at the students in the picture, the teacher. You can see the smile in their eyes. They're just glad to be back together. Community members right there helping us to be excited about our students coming back into the classroom. So we're really excited about the work we're doing. The pandemic is here. We have to pivot. I'm hopeful. Things are going to be great. Teachers are teaching, students are learning. We just have to change our mindset on what that looks like and be okay with it. So when we talk about the competency-based, when we talk about volunteering opportunities, when we talk about wrapping our arms around each other, we all can do this. We can't do it by ourselves in schools. Schools need you. We need all the collaboration, all the different community members and organizations to wrap around each other so that we can make this, we can get through this pandemic. We can. It may not be like we want it to be, which is a good thing, but we can move forward, and we're excited about it. And I'm gonna stop right there and just say thank you for this opportunity and for this time. And I know I didn't hit all the things, but I'll answer any questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boozer. That was very interesting. We all are invested in our kids, and we'd like to hear where things are going. Our third speaker for this session is Dr. Greg Howard. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Economics at the U of I, and he will be speaking on his topic of new directions of the global economy. So please welcome Dr. Howard. You want to flip that up, please?
Do we have to? Oh, there we go. Well, it's an interesting color, but the colors aren't important, so we'll just go with this. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk, and thanks to the presenters that have gone so far. This has been really interesting. Yeah, I just realized I still had that on. So I've been asked to talk about the new directions for the global economy today. Yogi Berra once said it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future, and that's no different for economists. So to make sure that you learn something useful from this talk, I'm going to start from kind of where we are today and things that I know very concretely, and I'll build on that to maybe speculate a little bit about where we're going for the future, and how I think that some of the stuff that we see today might have the potential to reshape the global economy. The three trends that I'm going to talk about that we see today are going to be slow labor market recovery. That's come up twice already in the two presentations, so you can tell that's really important. I'm going to talk about kind of supply bottlenecks that have been in the news a lot lately, kind of give my thoughts on that. And then rising house prices, something that we've seen around the world. And so these things are all things that we see in the US today, but they're also more broadly true around the world. So as thinking about the global economy, these are all things that matter. For the latter two topics in particular, I think these have some implications for how we should be thinking about future directions, things that might really change in the long run. And so I'm going to use the supply bottlenecks topic to then discuss the future of globalization, and I'm going to use the rising house prices topic to talk about the future of cities. And so you'll see when we get there. So the first thing I want to talk about is the slow labor market recovery. And so what this chart shows is just the number of US jobs in like the last 20 years. And you can see on the right the huge drop during COVID and the recovery, but that has not been, we're not back to the level of employment that we were before. We're down 4 million jobs. And it's been slower than I think a lot of people expected going to this. And so there are a bunch of reasons for that, right? One is that people are still very nervous about COVID, right? Going to work is a COVID risk, and we don't want to discount that. Another big piece of this is certainly childcare. So of these 4 million jobs, about 3 million are for women. And so we know that this is a really big issue for families. It's hard to, it's been hard to kind of manage getting back to the job. And another piece that gets talked about a lot is that, I mean, surprisingly enough, COVID has actually been very good for people's kind of checking and savings accounts. So the amount of cash on hand that people have means that they don't need to go back to a job that they might not like, or they might not need to do it right away. And so whether that's from a variety of causes, from the stimulus, or expanded unemployment benefits. It's also just from the lack of consumption opportunities during COVID. People were spending less money and they saved it up instead. And so now they don't have to go back to work to do it. But I also want to emphasize that this is a story that's not unique to COVID. If you look further back in time here, like back to the Great Recession, it took 7 years for us to get back to the level of employment that we had before in 2007. In 2001, which was a relatively mild recession, it took us 4 years for that to get back. And so while I think this is really important, it's something that we have to keep our eye on because we care about employment, we care about workers, we care about consumers and the businesses that need the workers. It's not something that I think is fundamentally different about the economy than it was in the past. And so I don't see it necessarily changing the way that the economy works in the long run. Now, in contrast to that, let's talk about another topic, which I think does. So the second thing I want to talk about is supply bottlenecks. And so if you haven't seen this picture, which has been in the news lately, this is just a satellite image of the port of Long Beach. And while it's a little hard to see on this screen, all those dots there are container ships that are waiting off of the port because they can't get into the dock to offload their goods, right? So these are all container ships that have come from Asia, typically. They're arriving in America. They're full of goods that people like us want, but they're stuck at sea. And obviously, to some extent, there are often a few ships. If you look at satellite images from before, there would be a few ships, but this is very atypical to see kind of this many ships that aren't able to do it, right? And this is probably the most visible anecdote about the supply bottlenecks that we've seen in the economy, but there are a lot more of them as well, right? So once these ships, once the containers do get off these ships, it's hard right now for them to find trucks to take them to the next step on the supply chain. You guys have all probably heard about the computer chip shortage that is driving up the price of cars and making them really hard to find right now, and how hard it is to get a new or a used car. And if you haven't heard about this, then you really should, because you should get on your Christmas shopping ASAP. It's going to be a much different season than we've seen in the past. Now, despite this name, these supply bottlenecks are not all about supply. In fact, I would argue that the main cause of these is actually a huge increase in demand. And if you can see in this chart, US spending on durable goods has just gone through the roof since the pandemic. So you could see kind of it was gradually increasing as we expected an economy to do. In normal times, it was growing, people were spending more money on durable goods. And it just shot up after the pandemic. We're at just enormous levels. And some of this is for the same reasons that we talked about with labor supply, right? So there's a lot of cash on hands, and there's been a lot of shifting consumption opportunities for people, right? So instead of being able to go to a restaurant during the pandemic, people were buying new goods. And so I think this is, these are the kind of the straightforward reasons that we've seen this happen. And so this huge increase in demand, supply has been unable to keep up, right? So we have so many more ships coming into the port of Long Beach. It's not that we got worse at processing those, it's just that there's so many more of them. And so we see this in a few different ways. So we see the bottlenecks. We also see rising prices, leading to kind of the short-run inflation that we are all hoping is transitory. But I think we do expect eventually that we will figure out solutions to these things, right? The bottlenecks are going to go away. Eventually, demand is going to come down, right? Like, I mean, once you buy a durable good, you don't need it again. You don't need to buy it again in the near future, and we think that that's going to be abated. But nonetheless, I do think that this topic has some really serious implications for the future of the global economy, and particularly around globalization. And the reason for that is that, well, there are two real reasons. One is that it's not clear that COVID's going away anytime soon. So this is just a chart of worldwide COVID cases. And so in contrast to the US, where we've had a few episodes where COVID cases actually got very low, it's never really gotten that low in the worldwide. And we think that this is going to cause ongoing supply disruptions in the long term. But perhaps even more importantly, what this has revealed is that our supply chain is somewhat fragile. That there can be disruptions that really change, that are much more disruptive and can hurt consumers and companies a lot more than I think we appreciated pre-COVID. And so going forward, I expect a lot of these supply chains will end up, people will try to reinvent them to make them more durable, less risky to these risks. That's not what I wanted to say, but so a really good analogy, I think, to think about this is what happened to the financial system after the 2007 crisis, right? So that was revealed that there were a lot of network effects from banks that were that ended up being obviously much worse than we realized. And so when we rebuilt it, through a combination of regulation and then also just banks not wanting to be at those risks again, they built the networks differently. And I think we'll see that again with kind of the supply chains around the world. So what does that mean, right? Typically, when we think about kind of more resilient supply chains, we're thinking about kind of just keeping supply chains more in-house or closer to home. And in some ways, what this would be is some sort of reversal of globalization, right? So instead of trying to outsource it to across the world, where a final good might have might have inputs from 50 different countries, you might see some slight reduction of that. And so I think we need to be thinking about and preparing for who would be the winners and the losers from such a shift. When we think about who's going to win and who's going to lose, the first thing that comes to mind is kind of the developing nations that produce a lot of the intermediate goods currently. I think they stand to be potentially big losers as companies become less willing to kind of to take on those risks of, oh, what if they get hit by COVID next year and we can't source these things? Maybe we can make it in-house instead. Consumers in advanced economies also likely to be losers in this situation because they face higher prices and maybe a reduction in kind of the infinite varieties of things that we can order with one click right now. The winners, I think, are going to be kind of the regions in the advanced economies that are like ready to produce intermediate goods and are willing to make those sorts of investments. I don't think that this is automatically going to be kind of a reversal of of when we increased globalization. I don't think like it means automatically that all the jobs are coming back to the Midwest or anything like that. But I do think it means that there's an opportunity for regions that are willing to invest in those sorts of, in that sort of manufacturing and in that production of intermediate goods in order to take advantage of these decreased and more robust supply chains. Okay. So the last topic I want to talk about in just my last couple minutes is thinking about the future of cities, and particularly I want to reflect on kind of what do the really high house prices that we see right now, what do those mean, and what does it mean for the future? So this chart shows the change year over year in house prices, and what we're seeing now is increases that we really haven't seen since the early 2000s boom. So house prices have gone up over 10% in the last year, and that really is a huge, a huge increase. Now this is definitely driven by COVID, and I think it reflects a changing preferences for where and for how much housing people want to consume. So the biggest change I think is going to be remote work that we've seen. Huge number of people have started to work remotely during the pandemic. Excuse me. Some are returning to work, but remote work is definitely something that's here to stay. And I think we can safely say that it's going to end up as a much more prevalent thing than it was in the before times, let's say. And so this reshapes preferences for housing in particular in two ways. It allows people to live further from their jobs without having to kind of make long commutes. So that might take the form of getting a house further out in the suburbs. It might also take the form of just buying a house on the beach and never going into your job at all. Second, it increases people's demands for space, right? So I think there's the very practical that a lot of us probably wanted to have a home office when we had to work from home, right? And we need an extra room for that. But I think it's also interpersonal. You're much less likely to be willing to put up with roommates if you're there 24/7. And I think especially of, say, people in their 20s that might have been living with their parents and not wanting to put up with that. And so what we've seen in response to that is a lot of increased household formation. So people are maybe moving out, maybe they're stopping living with their parents. Maybe some millennials finally have the cash on hand to start buying a house. Excuse me.
Would you like some more?
I'm almost done. I'll just power through for now. And so in the short term, this has put a big strain on the supply of housing, and that's why we've seen house prices rise. But what about the long term? How is this going to change kind of the future of the global economy? First, I think one of the big things that it means is that traditionally, let's say second-tier cities, so when I'm thinking like places like Denver or Nashville, or maybe even Champaign, really stand to gain from this as people want to live in kind of the high amenity places where housing is relatively cheap because they can now work remotely from those locations. In the long term, I'm also optimistic about housing costs. So over the past 20 years, housing costs have been kind of one of the biggest impediments to the rising standards of living because a lot of the economic growth that we've seen has been really concentrated in these really hard to build, really dense metropolises. And Americans have ended up kind of in a bidding war against one another to be able to live near these high-paying jobs. Now, what remote work means is that you don't need to be willing to pay so much more money for that. And so I think we'll see people moving out and living in places where it's potentially easier to build housing. So whether that's just out of city centers and into the suburbs, or whether that's to smaller cities that are high amenities, I think either of those forces would kind of decrease house costs in the long run. And I think we have reason to be optimistic that housing costs may come down. Okay, so those are the three things that I wanted to kind of speculate about in terms of the future of the global economy. I hope that kind of the big ideas are things that are things we agree that we should be looking forward to. We should be considering as we go forward. But to the extent that I made any predictions, you should probably ignore me. So in January 2020, I told the Daily Lion that the seniors were lucky to be graduating into a job market in a sustained boom, and we all know how that turned out. So, so when the future makes me look foolish for the remarks here today, too, feel free to let me know, either on by email or Twitter here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Howard. It's interesting to hear all three of our first speakers are optimistic about the future. I'm happy to see that, although they all bring forth change, and everyone has mentioned change in their employees and how they act. I think it'll be a challenge. You are free to stand up, take a break, 5-minute break here. If you have questions, please write them down, hand them in. We'll pick them up. The audience live here is small enough that we can quickly do that. We'll collate them, have them ready for the question and answer session afterwards. We will reassemble at 3:05. So, I'm sorry? Where do you want them? I was going to come and pick them up. is reducing atmospheric carbon dioxide through agricultural practices. Dr. Lisa Ainsworth. Dr. Ainsworth has two different positions. She's at the College of LAS, where she's an adjunct professor of plant biology, and she's also with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and doing some of her research. So, Dr. Ainsworth, please.
Okay, hopefully this will turn on soon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. And I've slightly changed the title of my talk.
You're not quite as tall.
No, I'm not as tall as really any of the others. Hopefully the slides will come up at some point. But I'm going to talk today about rising atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, the pandemic, and agriculture, and I hope to bring all of this together for you. So what this plot is showing you, the plot behind me, is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since it was measured on the top of Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii in 1957. So what you can see is that the concentration has increased from about 315 parts per million to today's concentration of over 415 parts per million. And every year, this CO2 concentration goes up and it comes back down again. And that's what you see, sort of the teeth marks in this curve that's increasing. And that is really the pulse of the planet. That is vegetation taking in CO2 through the process of photosynthesis and drawing the atmospheric CO2 concentration down. And then in the wintertime in the northern hemisphere, where most of the landmass is, we have respiration, and so CO2 is put back into the atmosphere. And so this curve of concentration in the atmosphere is really the pulse of our planet. It's how much photosynthesis and respiration all of the vegetation all over the earth is doing. So I just want you to keep that in mind first. And so then we can look at the croplands, agricultural lands on the Earth's surface. And so the green that you see in this map of the planet, the more green you see, the increasing fraction of that Earth's surface is in vegetation. And so a significant portion of our landscape is covered in agriculture. So what this means is that agriculture is a big part of this pulse, a big part of the global photosynthesis and respiration. And in fact, about 14% or 15% of the total photosynthesis on the planet, this includes all of the tropical rainforests, this includes the grasslands and savannas, about 15% is from agriculture. So the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is really concerning because it causes global warming. And so the surface of our Earth is over 1 degree Celsius warmer than it was just 100 years ago. And this trend is accelerating. And this is because we're putting more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's what this plot is showing you, the plot on the bottom. It shows you the temperature change from 1850 to 2020. And really in about 1950, temperature increases started to accelerate. And this is largely because of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. So the smaller plot, the box plot, is harder to see, but the red bars are just showing you different greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all of those are important agricultural greenhouse gases. They've all increased, and they are all contributing to warming. So when you looked at the plots of COVID from the previous talk, and we looked at how COVID caused a really big slowdown in the economy, the fact that we were all shut into our homes for 6 months had a noticeable signature on atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions. It's bigger than the signal from World War II. It's bigger than the signal from any recession that we've ever had. We shut down the planet in 4 months, and we saw an 8% decrease in our CO2 emissions. And so this was noticeable. Daily emissions were reduced by over 20%. And this plot is a little bit hard to see. This is just showing you different sectors. The one in green is showing you surface transportation and the decrease in CO2 emissions from surface transportation just from January to April of 2020. It was significant. Aviation is shown in pink here. This is another significant decrease. And so we're talking about 2 megatons of carbon dioxide per day, or 7.5 megatons of carbon dioxide per day lower, because we weren't driving, we weren't flying in airplanes, we weren't leaving our homes. And so this had a noticeable global and immediate impact. But it was short-lived. So in 2021, we've already rebounded. We're already adding CO2 back into the atmosphere at the rate that we anticipated as if there were no pandemic. And so that's what this plot is just showing you. It's showing you for some of the 20 biggest economies across the world. What you see, this big bump, the orange line, the orange bars here that are all above zero show you the increase in CO2 emissions in 2021 from fossil fuel combustion. And so basically, the globe has recovered in terms of its CO2 emissions, which of course is not a bad thing is not a good thing, because that means that our surface temperature is going to continue to increase. And if we don't change the directions of our emissions, then by 2100, the planet will probably be 4 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And it's hard to put these numbers into context, but this is the difference. We're talking about changes in temperature that are the difference between an ice age and the period that we live in now. So in geological times, these are big changes. You know, this is the Earth basically covered in ice or the Earth not covered in ice. These are the temperature changes that we're talking about. The other reason that improving the photosynthetic efficiency of crops is important is because if we can make each corn or soybean crop or cowpea or sugar beet or whatever crop it may be, if we can make each plant more efficient and more productive, then that's land that we can spare in the future for agriculture. And so I mentioned that croplands today are about 15% of global photosynthesis, but we're pushing into our rainforests across the world and we're pushing into our natural environments. And so if we can make our croplands more productive and more efficient, then we don't have to push into those forests that are so important in the natural lands. Another aspect of the research that we're doing that is important is adapting crops to future atmospheric and environmental conditions. So I think inevitably carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are increasing. Inevitably our planet is warming. We really can't stop that. Even if we stop all emissions today, the planet is still going to warm. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're adapting crops to that future environmental condition. And what I'm showing in this picture is one of our experimental fields where we are actually growing crops under totally open air conditions, but under altered atmospheres. And so the green that you see here are pipes that emit either CO2 or other air pollutants into the wind. Wind then carries that CO2 across these plots. And so these soybeans that are growing inside of this plot are growing at a higher CO2 concentration. We can also use infrared heaters to raise the temperature. We can use awnings to capture rainfall. So we can grow crops under higher CO2 concentrations, under drought stress, under temperature stress. And so we can prepare for the future, testing different environments. Another option is to actually sequester carbon onto our agricultural lands. And there are lots of approaches that people are testing today to do this. One that we're testing here at the University of Illinois is enhanced rock weathering. And so what we're doing is spreading basalt onto the landscape and testing whether spreading basalt and then growing crops on it will enhance rock weathering and sequester CO2. And so we already spread lime on fields. And so what we're testing is whether basalt can be mineralized or weathered more quickly by spreading it on agricultural lands. And this is work that's funded by the Leverhulme Foundation, and the people pictured here are Carl Bernacki, Evan DeLucia, and Dave Bierling, who are all also working on this project. So I'd just like to conclude and remind you that the reduction in daily global carbon dioxide emissions during COVID was temporary, and we've bounced back from that, unfortunately. Also, climate change has a profound effect on agriculture, and agriculture itself has a profound effect on the climate. And so agriculture can also contribute diverse solutions to the challenge through better stewardship, through better management and use of inputs, developing climate resilient crops, and enhancing carbon sequestration. I'm hopeful that we can meet this challenge. Thank you.
Another excellent talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Ainsworth. Our next talk is on new renewable energy sources by Dr. Andrew Stillwell, who is with the U of I College of Electrical Engineering. Andy? There you go.
So while we wait for this to come up, I appreciate that was an excellent lead into my talk, because much of what we're talking about when we talk about new sources of energy is carbon, right? Fundamentally, our energy usage is always coming down to where it is emitting carbon in our current infrastructure. And hopefully, we'll be able to convince you that we're working our way away from that, right? The goal is by 2050, we need to be carbon neutral globally when it comes to the energy sector. And that is to maintain or to keep under that 2% of global warming that was discussed earlier, right? So globally, the kind of agreed goal is get to carbon neutral by 2050 or hopefully earlier, and hopefully we can keep temperatures below that 2-degree rise. So my talk is going to focus on kind of energy today, talking about where we are and why we kind of find ourselves in this situation. And then we'll go into these 3 different energy sources that I think are going to lead the way kind of near term and long term when it comes to how we get ourselves out of this situation. So the first thing I want to look at is our U.S. energy right now. And basically our primary energies right now comes from a lot of different sources. And this is a plot of our overall energy usage over time. And so this is transportation, this is electricity usage, this is industrial usage, this is all of our energy usage going back to 1950. And one of the points I want to come out of this is actually over the past, say, 20 years or so, we've been relatively flat in our energy usage. You can see we've kind of stopped growing in how much energy we use in the US. And if you take into account the fact that our population has continued to grow over this time, our actual per-person energy usage has gone down over time. In fact, our per-person energy usage peaked sometime in the 1970s. And this should kind of make a little bit of sense because everything's getting a little bit more efficient, right? Our vehicles have better miles per gallon. Our air conditioner, each time you buy a new one, is likely more efficient than the last one. And the same goes for your fridge. And so while we talk about our energy usage in the US and how much we use per person, realize that, we're making progress on the efficiency standpoint already, but there's a lot of room to go. And I want to break down our energy usage a little bit more so we get an idea of what the challenge awaits us is, right? And so this is what's called a Sankey diagram, and it's a good way each year of kind of looking at our energy holistically. And we can think about all the different inputs to our energy system and our outputs, and then how that energy is delivered. And so let's break this down a little bit more. So the first part of this is the energy supply, right? How much energy comes from different sources. And so you can see on the left we have things like solar and nuclear and hydro. And if you kind of lump these together, we have renewable energy, which right now supplies only about 12% of our total energy usage. Fossil fuels are still up there close to 80% of our total energy. And again, this is including transportation, not just our electricity sector. And then overall, nuclear provides about 9% of our energy. So this is where we are today. And you can see this kind of broken down in the pie chart. Petroleum makes up a large source of our energy. Natural gas is another big chunk. And as much as we've really celebrated the growth of renewables, we still have a long ways to go on that. When we discuss how we deliver that energy, there's really these 2 sources, right? So there's the electric grid, which allows us to very efficiently transfer electricity across the US. And then we also have fuel to load, so how much of this fuel goes directly to the sources. And so this is our natural gas pipelines, this is our petroleum infrastructure. But right now, only about 40% of our electricity, or of our energy, actually flows through the electric grid right now. And this is something that we kind of think needs to change in order for us to really get to the gains we want to. The last piece of this is, where do we use energy? And it's relatively evenly split, right? So industrial and transportation consumes a lot of our overall energy. Residential and commercial are those next two pieces there. But you can see it's not one sector that overall is just dominating our energy usage. It's kind of across the board where we're pretty evenly distributed across this. And this makes a lot of sense, right? We still have a lot of industry here in the US. Residentially, very good population spread across a large landmass. And then transportation-wise, we know that Americans like to drive, right? That is part of our infrastructure right now, and it makes up a big part of our energy usage. And the kind of key strategy, our approach right now that engineers and scientists have kind of agreed upon is that for the most part, if we're really going to get to a carbon neutral economy, electrification is that key. And what do we mean by electrification? The main idea is that we decarbonize the grid. So everything that comes into our electric grid needs to be carbon neutral. The next step is to expand that generation. Not only do we get rid of those fossil fuels, but we need to increase our generation as well. And then we need to connect everything up to the grid. So all of our loads, instead of going directly to natural gas or petroleum, need to be connected to this grid. Now this is the high-level view. Not everything is going to be connected to the grid, and we're not going to fully decarbonize everything, but we need to get to that point where we're asymptotically getting to those values such that we can get to that carbon neutral goal by 2050. And I've talked in terms of US energy, but globally this is even a larger challenge. Because fundamentally, when we look at global, there's lots of developed economies, but there are some that are not there yet. And their energy usage is not flat. It needs to rise, right? They are not at the level of industrialization that other parts of the world are at, and they want to get there. They want to have the same quality of life, and we should celebrate that. We want them to get to have that same quality of life and to be able to increase their energy usage. But that means that fundamentally, how does that manage and how does that play into the picture as well? Because it's not always the cheapest solution that is the renewable solution for many of these developing economies. So I'm going to focus on the US, but let's keep that global picture in mind. We need to keep those sorts of solutions as part of our overall scope as well. So when we talk about our three energy sources, the first one I want to talk about is obvious, right? Renewables need to continue to fill out our portfolio. And fundamentally, renewables are going to continue to grow. So this chart on the left is specifically talking about wind energy. And really, you can look at it as 20 years ago, wind energy was pretty negligible when it came to how much it contributed to the grid. It was less than a percentage of our annual electricity usage. Now we're up around 9 to 10% of our electricity usage is coming from wind supply. And solar has also likewise grown. It's gone from basically nothing to it's up to 3%. And as you can see, it's kind of got this nice exponential growth with respect to how much is being deployed. And this needs to continue to grow. One of the main drivers in this adoption is cost, right? We're at the point where if you look at the levelized cost of energy, basically, you look at the costs of producing this energy and the capital costs and the continuing costs and the actual amount of energy that we can produce from that. It turns out that wind and solar are some of the cheapest sources of energy we have right now, and this is on new deployments. So when we continue to build this out, we're already at a point where wind and solar is at price parity, especially with gas, and especially when we've seen the fluctuations in the prices in gas right now. Green energy is cost effective at this point. It's got its challenges, which we'll discuss, but we're already there. And I'll point out that wind and solar have more room to grow. They will continue to get more cost effective as the technology continues to mature, and we'll continue to see this sort of drop. The other piece of the picture is that right now our fossil fuel generators are an aging fleet. If you look at our coal plants, if you look at our natural gas plants, a lot of them are actually reaching their natural end of their life cycle within the next, say, 10 to 15 years. So this is a study that one of my colleagues did, looking at basically if we just look at power plants, especially specifically coal plants, and let them retire when they get to the end of their natural life cycle, we're not actually stranding that much of our electricity generation from those plants by 2035, right? We don't actually have to shut down very many plants actively in order to get to our carbon targets by 2035. And so renewables are going to continue to grow because they're kind of cheapest at this point, and because a lot of our fossil fuel generators are naturally getting to their end of their life cycle. And these are good trends that we're going to continue to see. One thing that does need to be addressed and continues to be something that we're building out more of is storage, right? We know that the renewables that we rely on right now are intermittent, right? The sun's not always shining, the wind's not always blowing. And so both long-term and short-term energy storage is something that needs to continue to see investment in. And short-term is things like batteries, flywheels, but we're also seeing a really good growth in dispatchable loads. When we think about EV charging, this is a flexible load. There are times where absolutely I'm on the highway, I need that supercharge. But overnight, when I plug in my EV, I don't really care when it charges as long as by the next morning I have enough energy to get where I need to go. And so this is a dispatchable load, right? This is something that I can let the grid control as their own sort of load, and this is something, the flexibility that we need that kind of counterpoints our renewables, right? When we have all this excess wind generation at night, we want to have these loads that can take advantage of that electricity. HVAC is a similar one where we have some flexibility with this, but then there's also things like hydrogen generation, right? If we have excess electricity, let's convert that electricity into a fuel that we can use in other cases. Long-term is another piece of the puzzle where we think about seasonal type of changes, right? The sun shines the most, and where we have the most electricity from sun is during the summer, but we still need that electricity during the winter. So this long-term sort of storage where we can kind of bank this energy over the course of, say, days to months is also important. And pumped hydro is a good example of this, right? If we just pump some of our water back uphill to our reservoirs, we can release it through hydro and use this as a large battery. Compressed air storage is very similar to this, but there's also gravity-based solutions that are very interesting, where essentially you think about taking that electricity and turn it into potential energy that we can pull back later through other generators. So all of these kind of have a piece of the puzzle. I think hydrogen has an interesting role to play with this. You'll hear about things like the hydrogen economy, but we don't really know what that piece is yet. There are some very optimistic projections where hydrogen becomes kind of the replacement for natural gas. But there are others that are looking at this and saying, okay, this, we're really not going to get up to that level of industry for hydrogen, and we're not going to be able to really use it sustainably. I think hydrogen is going to have its place. I don't think it's going to be a catch-all for replacing natural gas. But it does look like one of those things where it's going to make sense in some scenarios and we should deploy it there, and in other scenarios it's not, and we shouldn't just force it into those scenarios as well. The last piece of our puzzle, or the next piece of our puzzle is efficiency, right? And I show a light bulb here. LED light bulbs are much more efficient than our incandescents, and we see them everywhere, right? This is a very big success story, but we can also think of this in terms of electric vehicles and in-home heating, for example. So for example, when you look at electric vehicles, if you look at the energy that goes into an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine, EVs are about 3 to 5 times more efficient in converting that energy into movement on the roadway. Now, fossil fuels have a lot higher energy density, and that's why we have the ability to go long distances with it. But fundamentally, electric motors are very, very efficient. And so from an energy perspective, we don't have to replace all of that petroleum energy with electricity energy, right? We can produce a fraction of that and hopefully still cover our entire transportation sector. Likewise, things like heat pumps and induction stovetops are fundamentally more efficient at heating our homes and doing our cooking needs than what we use now, either with just pure electric ranges or with electric or natural gas heating. From an efficiency standpoint, they are higher efficiency. And a good example of this is our new campus instructional facility, which is a few blocks that direction. They dug a lot of very deep geothermal wells. And from a high level, when it's hot outside and they need to cool the building, they can basically pump this heat down into those wells. And then when it's cold during the winter, they can pump that heat back out and heat the building. And we take advantage of this at a high level in the university in many different ways, right? We have these steam tunnels, we have these these cold chilled tunnels of water, and these thermal type of improvements we're very good at taking advantage of, but we need to continue to build those out. Now, these efficiency measures need to be affordable. They need to be for everyone, right? And so when you look at the headlines, EV infrastructure needs to be for everyone as well, not just our in-home solutions, but people that are in apartment buildings. Access in public spaces needs to be part of this. It's same thing with those energy efficiency improvements, right? The cost of these heat pumps needs to come down and be very broadly available for everyone. And I'll say that the recent Illinois bill that was targeted towards energy did a pretty good job at this, right? Equity was very much a central key theme of this. And so it included, for example, some EV subsidies for incomes, for households with incomes below a certain level. And there's quite a few of retraining for different populations as well, targeted towards getting a better workforce in the renewable energy sector. So that bill, I think, was a very good demonstration of what our bills should look like with respect to increasing equity access, but also increasing efficiency in renewable energy, our renewable energy portfolio. The other thing I'll point out of all of this is fundamentally whether we increase our efficiency or just use less energy, both of these are options. And using less energy in many cases is free, right? The less trips we make for different situations, and the more we can do telecommuting or at-home remote work, this is saving us trips to the store or trips to work as well. And this can overall reduce the amount of energy we use as well. A point I'll go back to, and I stole this quote from a very good friend on Twitter, but clean electricity is the plate at the decarbonization potluck. And he had used barbecue, but I think potluck fits us a little bit better. But everything gets loaded onto it, right? Without clean electricity, everything gets messy. So while we have to have these energy efficiency measures, and while we have to electrify everything, we have to have that clean grid first. Otherwise, once we have those EVs, they're still indirectly running on fossil fuels. So this has to be something we continue to focus on. The last piece is I do want to touch on the sci-fi, right? There are some interesting technologies out there that are going to be able to help us meet these, but these are long-term goals that we want to discuss. And I think two of the most promising are fusion and geothermal. And fusion has kind of had this reputation of the energy of tomorrow, or, of the energy of the future, but it's always going to be the energy of the future. But we're kind of coming up to the point where there's two really, I'll say, very engineered solutions for fusion that are working kind of through two different tracks that are projecting within the next 10 years that they will demonstrate more energy production than they put into the equation. And that's the goal with fusion, right? It's a clean technology. It does not require nuclear materials or anything along those lines, but you have to have these really high temperatures, and being able to contain those temperatures takes a lot of energy. They're to the point now where they think they can get to that within the next few years, and then continue to scale that up as other technologies get to that point as well. And so things like cryogenics and superconducting materials have really helped the cause of that, and those technologies are more mature. So the promise of fusion is, at least now within the next 10 to 20 years, as opposed to always being 10 to 20 years away. Again, this may be one of those future claims that 10 years from now I'm going to be eating my words, but it at least starts to look more feasible now. The other one is geothermal energy. And what's interesting about geothermal energy is we have this opportunity to kind of repurpose the oil and gas industry. Basically, you dig down deep enough, there's a lot of heat, and there's a lot of water available for us to use for power conversion. And so if you get down deep enough, and oil and gas is pretty good at that, we can have this free renewable energy source that can work with the rest of our portfolio. And the last point I'll pull in is perfection really should not get in the way of the better right now. We have wind, solar, and storage, and we have efficiency improvements that are relatively easy to implement, and we should be building those up. While geothermal and fusion are very promising and solve a lot of problems and maybe are an ideal solution, they're not here, and they're not here in the time frame that we need. So while wind and solar have their own challenges, and even battery technologies have their own challenges, and we all know that EVs are not perfect, they're better than what we have now, and we need to continue to work with what's better as opposed to waiting for what's perfect. And that's one of the big takeaways I want us to get out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That made me think of my days when I was back in high school and reading popular science and popular mechanics and learning about the future of where energy is going to come from and what we're going to be riding around in. Our next talk is addressing our pandemic-induced existential anxiety. There's a lot of that around. Dr. Brent Roberts from the U of I, he's the director of the Center for let me read it over here. I can't read my own writing. Social and Behavioral Science at the U of I. So it's all yours.
Appreciate it.
You can lift that up as you go.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be among such great speakers, though I have to admit my existential anxiety has been increased by listening to you all and having the illustrious duty of following you. You could have done less well. I think it would have been a pleasure to, but it was great to hear your talks. Let me see here. If I can find, not that one, no. Technology is on his way. So I'm here representing, let's say, a number of different constituencies or wearing a number of different hats. So I am a psychologist from the University of Illinois, and I study many of the issues related to psychological functioning and mental health. I'm also a director of a center, as noted, that has actually studied these issues in our community, both on campus and in the Champaign-Urbana area. And then I'm trying to represent the broader population of social scientists who have been working to understand these issues and some of the work that they've done. Aha, cool. Okay. And so I'd like to ask a few questions and answer them as quickly as possible, or let's say within 15 minutes. So the first question is, what is the mental health landscape of our era? I think it's really important to first start with what table was set, so to speak, for the pandemic as we came into this experience. What effect has the pandemic had on our mental health? So has it, and to what extent, caused us distress? How have things played out over time? I think time is a serious issue for us to consider when it comes to how we as humans have dealt with and adapted to our pandemic experience. What explains our reactions to the pandemic, which I think is critical for our understanding of what to do about it, and in future cases, how to handle our communities and societies more effectively if we want to prevent some of the distress that we've felt. Who was the most vulnerable, which is of course critical, and then what happened to our own community. So these are the questions I'll attempt to address. So first thing I want to note is that in the big picture when it comes to mental health, the pandemic hit at a time that was already one of distress. This is the Healthy Minds survey, which is a survey of about 500,000 college students in the United States that's done yearly. They were tracking a number of different things, including psychological distress. The top lines going up are depression and anxiety. These are the most common reasons why we enter our therapist's office or go to our medical systems to be treated, and they are on the rise and have been on the rise for the last decade or so. The third line is academic distress. This is just to note that we are next to an academic institution, and our students were, of course, feeling a lot of distress. Thankfully, the flatter line is suicidal ideation, which did not increase in this case. Nonetheless, we are in an era of increasing psychological distress. That's the negative thing. So the pandemic hit as basically when we were down. You could think of it that way. On the broader social science side, this was already alluded to in some of the discussions. We are in the time of digital sophistication and interplay. So we all have our devices. We all speak to one another in different media, Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook and the like. And this has changed our world quite tremendously. Some would say for the worse, some would say for the better. So it's given us a lot more information, a lot more data, a lot more immediacy when it comes to these things. And we have social scientists studying that. We also have a tremendous amount of social science. There's an explosion of it over the last decade or so in terms of the number of studies being done here and elsewhere, providing us with more data than we could ever really even contemplate. Let me tell you about some of that data. So this first data goes to the question of whether the pandemic caused us distress. This is a study of 200 different countries and whether the diagnoses of depression and anxiety increased in 2020, the year of the pandemic, in relationship to prior years. And so this graph, which had the U of I colors, which no longer exist, will show you basically that in 2019, which is the lower shaded area, which is supposed to be blue, we had a number of thousands of people per 100,000 reporting anxiety and depression. And then the lighter orangish colors up top were for 2020. And what you see with that is that there's been about a 20 to 30% increase in the diagnoses of anxiety and depressive disorders across the globe. The lines cut across the life course from young to old and between men and women. The top graph is depression, the bottom graph is anxiety. You might note that the problems were centered in younger people, of course, because that is actually the center of most distress in the life course. Our younger folk experience it more than those of us who are more chronologically challenged, as I like to say. And then women were disproportionately affected compared to men. And so this is important to note, and I'll come back to that in a second. So in no uncertain terms, the pandemic was associated with a dramatic increase in mental health issues across the globe. How did that play out over time? This is data from the Understanding America study. This is a study that I'm an advisor on, which studies a panel of US citizens across the country. It's a representative sample of 10,000 people. It's a very interesting and nimble study that took upon itself to actually change its goals once the pandemic hit, and they went out and they assessed their participants every week and have been doing that for the entire pandemic to get a better understanding of how things have played out over time. And as you can see here, you see an increase, of course, immediately in March and April of 2020, where most of us were feeling that free-floating existential anxiety because, of course, the virus is invisible, when we were all sitting in our houses wondering what would happen. And we were all experiencing an increase in anxiety and distress. And then, interestingly, over time, most of us came back to baseline. And this is an important thing to note in terms of our conversations about mental illness and mental health in relationship to these types of events. This peak and recovery pattern is ubiquitous. Every single large-scale tragedy that we tend to study shows the same type of effect. If you have an economic downturn, same type of thing, distress, then recovery. Other countries have had pandemics in the past, same type of experience. This is the pattern that occurs, and it's important to understand in relationship to how we think about this. I should also note that it could, of course, happen again. This is only the first wave of the pandemic. We've had 2 more since then. I'm waiting for the data to emerge, but most likely we'll see the same kind of scalloping, where as our communities and our countries suffer distress again, we will suffer more mental illness. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this. This is a wonderful study done by a colleague, Jamie Pennybaker, at the University of Texas, where they utilized the new platforms to get interesting data. These are emotion terms gathered from Reddit. They took city Reddit exchanges. So where you were in Champaign-Urbana, you can go on a Reddit and talk to your fellow Champaign-Urbana citizens and discuss things. They did that for 19 different cities across the US. And so these individuals are not in the least bit under the knowledge that they're being studied for COVID. They're just behaving. And they took all of the words that were written in those conversations, and then they screened them for different emotions terms. And what did they find? They found for anxiety what you would expect from what I just gave you, that we increased in that March-April period in the beginning of the pandemic much higher and much more dramatically than 2019, which is the flat line that you can barely see underneath. And then we came back to baseline. Anger was interesting. We got less angry as we were isolated. But then we returned to where we were before, which is not necessarily a good thing because we've been increasingly angry for the last decade. And then sadness, which is the bottom left quadrant over there, was increased as you might expect. And unlike the other types of emotions, it stayed higher and stayed higher than our prior levels. And then the fourth category is positive emotion. We plummeted. We were less happy, more depressed. But then we've come back to baseline since that time. So this is a wonderful example of where we might malign our social media. It provides amazing data for us social scientists to study and to demonstrate the kind of phenomena that might only be available through structured surveys and the like, but showing this in real behavior that people are exhibiting across the country. Why did we experience distress? Perceived health risk is the primary reason. If we feared that we were going to get sick and that we had the potential to pass away as a result of that, we suffered more anxiety and depression. My favorite example of that is actually a global one. Yeah, you can see this. So these are the global rates of depression and anxiety. This one's actually anxiety. The blue countries are the ones that didn't experience an increase in anxiety. The rest of the world did. And you might notice the countries that were not experiencing distress: New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, China, most of the Southeast Asian countries that all managed the pandemic. However you agree or disagree with their policies, they did it better than most of the other countries. They didn't have the outbreaks, they didn't have the maladies, they didn't have the deaths that the other countries did, and you see the effect of that. If your country or your community can effectively manage something like the pandemic more effectively, people experience less distress, which has profound implications for what our communities and societies do or suffer as a result of this. And so this is one, at least, piece of evidence for that. This happened at the country level, at the community level, and at the individual level. So to the extent that we can control things, things are better. The second most important thing was something that we've discussed already, which is financial and employment issues. So if you feared that you were going to lose your job or you lost your job, you suffered disproportionately. We know this from a lot of different research. Lifestyle changes, we suffered through our first experience of isolation for most of us. This was not taken well by most of us either. Substance use increased in many places, especially places like the UK. That led to anxiety and depression. And then perceived discrimination. Many people experience more of it, especially, for example, our Asian communities, which were inappropriately maligned as being the cause of this. They suffered more psychologically as a consequence. It is in order of the magnitude of the problems. So the biggest problems were whether you thought you would get sick and whether you suffered a risk in terms of your financial issues. Okay. Who was more vulnerable? I already mentioned this in passing. Women were, younger populations were. Those already suffering from mental health challenges. So there's a lot of folks in our communities that have psychological issues that they're managing, wrestling with, and the like. They suffered disproportionately compared to other people. And then, of course, those who are financially vulnerable. So these are the populations we might want to consider going forward in terms of understanding how we might manage these situations in our future pandemics. Finally, I want to show you what we found in our community. So at the CSBS, we conducted a longitudinal study of our community members in the fall of 2020. We were very curious to see how we would handle opening up the university again, bringing everybody back, and seeing what happened psychologically. The story is not as exciting as you might expect, but it's still important. Over that first semester, we didn't see dramatic changes in psychological functioning, especially in this case, anxiety. What we did see was that faculty, staff, students, and community members were all much more distressed than comparative populations, in this case, the Understanding America study that we could look at. So for better or worse, we caused ourselves a lot of distress, but we managed it nonetheless. Okay, so to summarize, our community was like many others. We all experienced increases and then decreases in distress. Certain people in our community suffered more than others, the ones who are more vulnerable, of course. And then I'd like to note that we really still don't know what the long-term consequences of this experience are going to be. We don't know, for example, what the economic ramifications of a 25% increase in depression and anxiety are going to be. They're going to be there. We don't have the data yet. We don't know what the experience of a depressive episode or an anxiety or a panic attack has in subsequent psychological health and functioning, which also has ramifications for a number of things, staying in school, staying in the labor market, for example. I can only say that maybe if you invite me back in a year, I'll report what we find in the interim, and hopefully the news will be good. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we've had the pleasure of 6 excellent speakers. A good way to spend a rainy afternoon. And a good topic for all of us. It's extremely important, and I think all of the speakers have done themselves proud. I'll ask the monitors, myself and Tom, to see if there are more questions that could be submitted for the final 3 speakers. We'll have the speakers come up front, and then I will finish collating the questions, and we'll pose them to the speakers. We have, okay.
Let me adjust ourselves.
We do not want to play favorites here. Threw things off when I sat here. I hadn't intended to do that. Okay, I'll start off with the first speakers. And Dr. Leonard, as always in conferences like this, gets a lot of questions. So I'll start off with him. I'll give you a list of questions, and then you can just come up and speak according to what you want to talk about. Interestingly, several of the audience were interested in how many people in Unit 4 and at Carl are vaccinated. How many of the workers are vaccinated? Seems to be a hot topic. The second thing, that one should be relatively short. Do you think mRNA technology will lead to quick vaccine breakthroughs on a wider range of disease agents such as coronavirus, rhinovirus, other cold and flu viruses? And will it take massive government investment, or will private funds be involved? So those are the 2 critical ones I have for you.
Thank you for the questions. At this point in time, 85% of the Carl employees are vaccinated. Now, the interesting part of that story is that 2 months ago, 72% of the Carl employees were vaccinated. When you look at the subsets of who is not vaccinated, so if I can go a step further, Chuck, just I think it's important because of the vaccine resistance and some of the discussions going on around the country. So when you look at the Carl, which is 11,000 people, I should give you the N, the largest number of unvaccinated people are 25 to 40 females, typically in the nursing ranks and often in the ICUs. Now, that various reasons are given in terms of their concerns about reproduction and different things, and I won't go any further than that, but it's interesting. You then look at the second largest number of workers that are not vaccinated at this point, and it tends to be in some of our minority populations, and vaccine reluctance there. And again, discussions regarding historical issues, trust, and different reasons. And so we've worked real hard over the last couple of months to do a lot of individual and small group education and I'm very pleased that we moved the needle 13% without threat of firing people, although we have put mitigations in place. And I know those go back and forth in terms of people's opinions about that. The second question regarding the messenger RNA, which has been under development for over a decade, and I can't tell you from my perspective how grateful I am that that is true. When you look at the normal time frame to be able to roll out a vaccination, and I'm a little bit on my soapbox here, and I recognize that. In March of 2020, I had nothing to offer other than general medical support, and we were praying for a vaccination. In December of 2020, when those vaccinations became available, all of a sudden we had a tool that really did make a difference. And if you'll recall, it was like something out of the movie Braveheart, of people running to get the vaccination and the lines, et cetera, until we hit the vaccine hesitancy. So the mRNA, I am just very grateful that it was available, that it was developed so quickly. And the answer to the question from my perspective and understanding of the literature is a number of vaccinations will now follow that will be made available to us as a society and will be able to be developed much more rapidly. As to the funding of that, I'm less certain as to how that gets done in terms of, I'm sure it'll be a joint effort between government, academia, as well as the general companies. Very good?
Very good.
Okay.
Excellent, as usual. Thank you.
Can I say one other thing?
Of course.
So just one other point, because I just want to make sure that everyone's aware. As we sit here today, and Professor Roberts mentioned some of the statistics and how the 3 waves that we've gone through. Throughout the 3rd wave, which started really in August here in downstate Illinois, which was a less significant wave than what we had in 2020, we have had patients who have been vaccinated every day who have been in the hospital. About 20 to 25% of the patients who are hospitalized are vaccinated, but they are typically not in the ICU, they're more in the general medical floor, and they do not die unless they have significant underlying medical issues. So I just, truth. Stay, okay.
I found one more.
Okay.
For you that it says for either Dr. Roberts or Dr. Leonard.
Well, let's
so
give it to
we'll get
Dr.
you both.
Roberts.
We'll get you done here. Are you in favor of mandates for COVID vaccination? If not, why not? If yes, how can we enforce mandates? Now, there's a question.
Now, there's a question, and that's a question I wrestled with our ethics committee and a number of scientists, quite frankly, for a number of weeks. And we decided, and I take responsibility for driving this decision, that we would require vaccination. Now, what we found as we looked at what everybody was saying across the entire country, what comes next really becomes the part that people are interested in, is what are you going to do if they say no? And what we decided was that there would be mitigation, but that we would go down testing, education, and other routes. We would not fire people. Now, some states, some companies have decided that if you say no, you're out. We have not been willing to go there. I was not willing to go there because we do not have a vaccination that is 100% effective. And so if it's not 100% effective, how could I mandate it? And the second thing was, prior to the vaccinations, we had demonstrated that with appropriate mitigation, with face masks, social distancing, and the other things that we were doing, that we could have a significant impact on the transmission. And so I was comfortable that the mitigations that we put in place, although difficult for some people getting tested once or twice a week and an expense, that we should make that rather than an absolute, you're fired if you don't take it. And so that's what we did and why.
Thank you, Dr. Leonard. Certainly appreciate those insights from the medical side. Dr. Boozer, you were second. I'll give you a list of questions. I've had a chance to show you some of them, and I'll read them. The pandemic school impact, as you pointed out, reminds us that classrooms and conventional teaching are just a fraction of the learning process. What extra Unit 4 and community investment is needed to build lending student opportunities outside of class? The second question is, if you'd say a word or two about the high-performance internet system and its role in the community. How able are we to connect everyone with the high-performance internet? I know you touched on that in your talk, but perhaps a little extra. And then again, as I mentioned when I talked to Dr. Leonard, what percentage of your employees are vaccinated? That seems to be a interesting topic.
Appreciate it. Whoops, that's what happened. So you wear the glasses. All righty, I'm gonna start with that easy question first. The percentage of Unit 4 staff that are vaccinated. As the last time I checked, we were over 87% of Unit 4 staff vaccinated, and that includes every facet of our staff. And we're also continuing to offer vaccination clinics in various locations, so at our bus barn, at our high schools. So that's what we're doing. And for the same exact reason that Dr. Leonard mentioned, some of the reasons some of our folks are not vaccinated are mostly in our minority population and due to trust, lack of trust, things of that nature. So we're doing a lot of educating and opening the doors and continuing. And we too have not said you can't be here if you're not vaccinated. So it's either you get vaccinated, we educate you, or you provide proof of your testing, your COVID test results. So, okay, let's go with some of the other questions you have. High performance internet. How do we proceed to accomplish this? That is going to take infrastructure from the city and different other entities to help us out. We can provide the devices, which we have, to all of our staff and our students, whether we're one-to-one, but making sure we have the hotspots and the connectivity is something that we as a community have to come together to make happen. So in different locations, if we can get them on our buses, if we can get them in our downtown areas, if we get them in our different restaurants and parks or what have you, we're just opening the doors and making sure people have an opportunity to have connectivity in their own homes at a low to no cost, because we have to address that digital divide. And the pandemic basically really showed the light on the fact that the connectivity issue was alive and well. So it's going to take some work, and we have lots of partnerships in the community who are coming to say, how can we help? And so we'll be having more conversations with those who want to help us out with this, and we'll be at the table and making sure we address this issue. Let's see, another question was the impact opponent reminds about the classroom and conventional teaching are just a fraction of the learning process. What extra Unit 4 and community investment is needed to build leading student opportunities outside the classroom? That's a great question. So understanding when I talked about the whole competency-based education approach, and having different entities and such as the university coming to the table with us to talk about what does education look like, and how do we pivot and change our traditional educational system so that we can build student opportunities. What we're also finding is even though learning was happening, we still find that we're going to have some students who are not quite ready to be in the workforce or go to the college and be successful after they graduate this school year. So how do we extend that learning is what we're going to need to focus on. What does that look like? How do we provide maybe that 5th year of high school for some of our students? Or do we have some programs in our colleges or community colleges that will say, okay, we will wrap around the students who come in and we'll look at the data that you have and say, okay, you're not quite ready for the college experience, but we can provide you with smaller class sizes. We can give you extra support. We can help with some extending of the learning based upon what the data is saying. So we also looked at how do we look at the expectations for what does it mean to graduate on time. And there are some things that we just had to say, okay, we're not going to offer this time. We're not going to make this a requirement because we don't want to have our kids feel like they cannot go to the next level because they didn't meet some kind of requirement that we may have put a barrier there. So how do we meet and talk with our community partners and say, okay, this was a barrier, how can we address it? If we wrap around and do this together, what does it look like? Do we have all the answers? No, but we do realize we have to do something different. And different means it's equitable. What does it mean for you may be different for me. So we have to just be open to that idea. And I believe that we're just going to have to extend the learning beyond the traditional classroom. We cannot do all of it in the classroom environment. We have to go outside the classroom. And what does that look like? So we're going to be talking about that. And we're open to those ideas and suggestions. So if anyone wants to come to us and say, hey, we have this idea, we're willing to come to the table and have that conversation. Then there's a question about how are the studies published on the impact of remote education. I believe the 29th of this month, the state superintendent for the state of Illinois will be talking about the impact of remote learning and education that we had over the past year and looking at our data. In Unit 4, we utilized the map data to when the students came in so we could get some baseline as to where they are, to see how things are. And we were quite impressed that students did not come in with as much learning loss as people expected them to have, but we did notice there's some unfinished learning, so you can't lose what you were never taught. So that's why we get away from that terminology. No learning was lost because we weren't able to teach some of the areas, but some of the areas we did teach, we're noticing that their students are doing well. So look forward to the Unit 4 school report card that'll be coming forward that will show you some of our data that our students are on track to graduate, but we may have to do some things different, as I stated before, extending that learning beyond the traditional classroom environment. So that's what we looked at. We looked at the IAR data that our 3rd through 8th graders took, and not all of them took that. So we can't just base it upon that. So we have our own internal measures that we utilize across our system from kindergarten through 12th to 9th grade, I believe, maybe 12th. And we look at that data, and we're seeing that our students did make some progress. We have some solid baseline data that we'll be moving forward with. And so we'll be using that data and assessing our students each quarter, well, I should say 3 times a year, to see and make sure we're making the growth. And we'll use that data to measure where we are and where we need to go. That's it.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're getting wonderful feedback to the questions. We'll continue with Dr. Howard. A couple questions here. How do you anticipate the growth of artificial intelligence affecting the economy? And what is the university doing to help fill the worker shortage? And if you want to add something on it, what's your prediction about inflation?
All right, these are great questions, and future directions of the global economy can go in a lot of different directions, and I think these questions reflect that. Okay, so first of all, the growth of AI. I think this is one of the big questions in economics. It's a very active area of research and attempts to do forecasting. And frankly, I think the answer is that I don't know. There's a lot of ways in which artificial intelligence, I think, can displace workers and will displace certain types of skills that workers have, and certainly there will be people that lose their jobs because of artificial intelligence in the future. Whether the net effect of the fact that artificial intelligence also complements a lot of skills that people have or that they could be taught, you can see ways in which it would help workers, but it's really a hard question, and I think it's not something that I would venture to try to forecast right now. Okay, so then the second question was about how can the university help fill the worker shortage. It's another great question. Another one that I don't know that I have a really solid answer to. I mean, I do think that, like I said in my remarks, I think the worker shortage really is this confluence of short-term factors around COVID, right? So a lot of the things that I think are really important to fix in terms of getting people back to work are things like getting the public health right and trying to reduce cases of COVID around the community and around the country and around the world. For the other ones that I identified were kind of childcare and thinking about that. And so there are a few ways you could imagine, but I'm not sure that the university in particular is the place to be fixing that. And then lastly, kind of the fact that we just do have, that people aren't being kind of forced back to work by, because they do have kind of extra cash around. I mean, that's really not necessarily a problem. I mean, it's a problem from the trying to hire side, but it's hard to say that, oh, well, that's an issue for the workers. So, so those are some thoughts. I'm not sure that they really answered the question very well, but that's all I've got right now. Finally, my prediction on inflation. This one, I think, I mentioned briefly that we were all hoping that this is transitory, and I think that there are a lot of reasons to think that it is. But inflation is also very tied to people's expectations about future inflation, and if we get used to it, if we get used to high inflation over the next year, it very well could take off and be something that we have to fix with higher interest rates or reduce government spending, and that's very costly. And so you hope that kind of you fix some of the supply chain issues and that this happens before people kind of get used to higher inflation. And so kind of there is some urgency to that from an inflation perspective. So thank you.
Thank you. So part of it depends, part of the question on inflation depends upon how this massive personal savings that has occurred in this country is spent, whether it's spent on hard goods all at once or whether it's spent on services. I think that's a real question, isn't it? Yeah. Dr. Ainsworth? I really appreciated your talks and what you were talking about the environment. But we have a question here that it says, if we cover our productive soil with solar panels, is this really a good exchange? Lisa said crops help lower our global warming. Is there a better way than covering a few thousand acres of Champagne farm ground?
Okay, so the question is about whether we should cover croplands with solar panels. And I think the answer to most questions is it depends, and there's always going to be a trade-off. If you have very productive croplands, then covering it with solar panels is probably not a good economic decision, nor is it a good decision in terms of the potential for carbon sequestration. But if you have less productive land, maybe land that is more marginal or doesn't produce as well, then there are solar panels that also can tilt, and so you can plant things underneath those solar panels. You could imagine a perennial crop growing underneath it that's sequestering carbon, pulling carbon into the roots and into the soil, and then the solar panels can, lift up to allow light to get to the plants, and then they can capture sun during parts of the season and parts of the year when crops are less productive. So I think that answer will depend, and every situation will be different. It's a good question.
I think the person who asked that question might also refer to the recent News Gazette article talking about just what you said. There are ways to use the land both for crops and for collection of solar, but these are studies that are ongoing. The university is actively participating in this, and we certainly have seen a marked improvement in the efficiency of solar panels and solar electricity in general. It certainly is going to fit into a very essential part of our green energy. So I would add that to that. So Dr. Stillwell, you're up next. The questions before you get here are there studies regarding correlations between the types of media people follow and stress? I think that might have been for Dr. Roberts. But it's directed to Dr. Stillwell, but the political, let's leave that one for Dr. Roberts. Dr. Stillwell, one concern about energy efficiency is the saving energy usually saves money. So consumers will spend the saved money elsewhere, which has its own energy costs. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and one that not only kind of covers energy, but covers psychology, it covers economics, it covers lots of different consumer spending habits. The way I think many look at it, and there's, I think, a technical term, kind of this rebound effect, where you get this energy efficiency, so you have more money, and part of that is maybe you just spend more energy now because, before you turn the lights off to save money, but now you just leave them on longer because they're more efficient. Many studies have found, at least when it comes to energy usage, that doesn't happen very often, right? Our habits are pretty ingrained when it comes to how we use energy and, where we keep our HVAC settings and things like that. Where I look at it with respect to consuming, I think it's a good problem to have, but it kind of comes down to more of the mindset of not spending out of our overabundance and making sure that we are using what we need and being conscious in all our decisions on how we're using our energy, right? And so, yes, I put in a more efficient HVAC unit and I save on my monthly bills. Now that maybe allows me to buy something, a better electric vehicle as opposed to holding on to my gasoline vehicle for a little bit longer. We can't fundamentally consume our way out of the problems that we have right now. We can't just always buy our way out of our issues. And that has to be something we have to keep in mind. And electric bikes are a good example of this. We've seen a lot of news about electric bikes right now in both with respect to tax incentives for electric bikes, and just the surge in production and buying of electric bikes right now. And electric bikes are great, right? You plug them into the wall, you have a bike, and you can get to the store and back. That kind of spending where it is replacing transportation with respect to replacing a car trip should be our goal when it comes to our green infrastructure and our green spending. But where it comes to I buy an electric bike and now where I would have walked somewhere and now I'm going to take the electric bike instead, that is not as beneficial to the system and is something that we have to be conscious of when we're really incentivizing some of these green technologies. So it is a challenge and it is a concern, but it has to be kind of our conscious of why we are doing things more efficiently and why we are being more green. Like the ultimate goal is to reduce that carbon, is to reduce our pollution. And if every decision we make along the line is not towards that, then we do have there is that risk that we are making a step back, and for whatever gain we're making, we're taking that 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. So it is a concern. It is something we have to look out for. It's something that has to be part of our mindset when we are making these efficiency gains.
I have one more for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's rather parochial. Should Wesley install parking lot outlets for electrical vehicles? Would a fee be needed, and could it be free?
So the question was should, correct?
I interpret it how you will.
Okay. So there's a few different ways of looking at this. From the ease of access standpoint of encouraging and making EV usage easier, yes, having some charging solutions here would be beneficial. I don't know that we need to put in a fast charger in our parking lot, though, especially from the standpoint of what is our use case? What are we trying to drive? And I think, one goal, for example, would just be having infrastructure so that if someone is in the area and they need to be topped off a little bit so that they can get home or get to another charger, that is something that we can provide pretty economically and relatively easily, and still encourages a bit of adoption. So something, basically a type 1 charger where it allows someone to get a few miles so that they can get to a fast charger. Something like that makes sense, and I think is a good community service. I don't think that would be a large expense for us, and I don't think that's something we should charge for. If you wanted to further increase adoption or maybe encourage it and include something as a level 2 or a fast charger or something like that, that is something that we could supply and say part of our parking lot is dedicated to that, but that already has some mechanisms where it is billed at a reasonable outlet, and that's not something we'd want to manage ourselves anyway. So I think a lot of that would come down to what is our goal. Do we want to allow someone to just get home, or do we really want to help be a gas station, essentially, with respect to being a charging point? And personally, I think the former of allowing someone to charge up enough that they can get to another resource and just being a good neighbor is probably the route I would suggest.
Thank you. All right, we can't let Dr. Roberts go without a question. And are there studies regarding correlations between the types of media people follow and stress? Political focus of media, parentheses Fox versus MSNBC versus PBS versus Reuters versus Associated Press versus BBC, etc.
Well, the honest answer is I don't know, because we usually don't address that level of specificity. Most people, when they ask this question, are interested in whether their teenagers are suffering disproportionately because they're on Facebook, not on Facebook, they're not on Facebook, on Instagram or the like. There are obvious psychological consequences for where we get our news information from. Absolutely. In fact, if you want to know about the pandemic, you should know people's political orientation first, because it is the most significant predictor of things like whether you're going to get vaccinated, whether you're going to wear a mask, whether you're going to support those types of activities. It's a remarkable thing. One of the most profoundly strong social effects that I've ever seen in my experience. It's really quite distressing. So I can say the question distresses me, and politics is obviously an underpinning factor in the way information is consumed and our reaction to the pandemic. I haven't seen somebody link all those up in terms of the consequences. So if you think about the factors that contribute to our distress, the root of all of them is uncertainty. If we structure things better, if we effectively handle the pandemic better, if we make sure that people aren't dispossessed of their jobs and their well-being in that respect, then they do better. So to what extent do our different political ideologies provide us with that kind of security would be the question you would have to ask. So in that case, I'd almost guess that the conservatives are probably going to do better because they're getting a more assured statement, if it might be construed as misinformation, about how things are to be handled than the MSNBC crowd, which is being told the complexity of the situation. But we might also ask whether that's the most important factor for our well-being.
Thank you.
No problem.
That's really about all the questions we can get to in the time frame. We've already gone over the expected time. I apologize for not covering everything. I would like to say a couple words in addition to thanks to the panel for this excellent discussion as well as for their individual talks. I feel educated and it's stimulated, and I hope the audience in general feels the same. Our world is rapidly changing. In other such times in centuries past, significant social change has resulted. In our time, we face the probability that our normal no longer will be the norm. Our news sources have changed from newspapers and a nightly roundup of TV news to a constant stream of headlines with the facts that are often, all too often, contradictory. I'm talking about all the, quote, news that we get on personal channels. We're exposed to news from around the world that demand our attention as we face the challenges in our own lives. People are anxious and restive. We see all these problems, but have few solutions that we can agree upon. We as a society are focused on individual rights, but neglect the common good. People profess a lack of faith in anything or anyone. Trust seems to be a thing of the past for many. Our youth are resorting to ever-present guns to solve their differences. We need to take a breath, consider what we can do to help, and look for ways to move forward instead of blocking the paths of others. Our seminars are focused on helping us take that breath and move intelligently forward. Our speakers today have given us their wisdom to help us do so. Please give another round of applause to our speakers, our hosts, the planners of the seminar, and yes, to yourselves for devoting this afternoon as a collective effort to understand and improve our world. Thank you for coming.